In this video I'm going to cover the Takumar 55mm series of lenses. I'll describe the different versions of the lens, explain their physical and optical characteristics, and discuss how good they are on today's digital cameras. If you walked into a camera shop in the early 1970s and asked them to recommend the best camera and lens for an enthusiastic amateur photographer, then they may well have recommended this camera, the Pentax Spotmatic SP2, and this standard Fast 50, a super multi-coated Takumar 55 f1.8. At the time, the Spotmatic was a best-selling SLR camera worldwide, and for good reason. It was an excellent camera. It was solidly made, reliable, not too bulky, and it had a good range of features, good enough for professional photographers as well. Alongside the camera, Pentax sold a range of interchangeable M42 mount lenses using the Takumar brand name, and the 55mm was one of the Fast 50s on offer. The lens was beautifully engineered, with an all-metal body, excellent optics, and a wonderfully smooth focus throw. As a high-quality, good-value standard Fast 50, the lens was very popular in the early 1970s, and it still is today. And the good news is that Pentax made a lot of these lenses, and they made them so well that they've tended to wear well, especially if they were looked after, so it's not particularly expensive to find a good copy to buy online. Now, this particular lens didn't appear out of the blue. It built on a strong legacy of lens design by Asahi Pentax, which began in the early 1950s with M39 mount lenses, followed by the launch of their first M42 mount SLR camera in 1957, the AP, and the first of the Takumar 55mm. Between 1957 and 1974, Pentax developed and sold millions of these M42 55mm lenses in various models. Over the years, the lens designers introduced a number of mechanical, optical, and style changes. There were more than just cosmetic changes, as we'll see. There were some class-leading innovations. Even within some of the main model types, for example the Super-Takumars, there were different versions sold to the public. And with so many different versions, it's easy to get confused about how precisely the lenses are different and which ones are the best to buy. And I hope I'll be able to shed some light on all this in the video. First off is this Takumar 55 f2.2 launched in 1957. I don't own the earliest Takumar 55 f1.8 from 1958. It's very rare, only around 1,000 were made, but this f2.2 lens is very similar, at least in looks. The lens was sold as a standard prime lens with the first Asahi Pentax SLR camera with an M42 mount, this Pentax AP. The other lens here is a Takumar 58 f2, an alternative option based on a Sonner-type design, and I'll include this lens in some of the tests I'll show you later. I mentioned the 58 Sonner design because Pentax tried a number of different designs before fixing on the final design for their Fast 50s. If you're interested in the differences between these types of design, then the web has some information to look up. Suffice it to say that the Pentax lens designers decided that the classic Ultron design, with 6 elements in 5 groups, was the best for the 55mm. They dropped the Sonner type 58mm f2 pretty quickly, and used the Ultron design for all subsequent M42 screw-mount lenses, and the first K-mount 55. So returning to the very early 55mm f2.2, it's apparently a Gaussian-type design, and it has 5 elements in 5 groups. It's a preset lens with 10 aperture blades. The preset mechanism allows you to set the aperture to a stop-down value using one ring, but then use a second ring to move the aperture to wide open for a brighter view when focusing. Then you can move the second ring back to the stop-down value. I personally enjoy using preset lenses on digital cameras, not simply for photography, when you can work out the impact of stopping down with a clickless aperture ring, but also for video work. The next set of 55mm lenses were called Auto-Takumars. This is the Auto-Takumar 55 f1.8 with its rather fetching zebra design. The lens was based on the classic Ultron design with 6 elements in 5 groups, used from this point onwards. Rather than a preset mechanism, the lens had a spring-loaded cocking lever. The lever opened up the aperture to wide open for that brighter view, even though the aperture ring was actually still set to stop down. Unlike the preset lens, you didn't need to do anything else before taking a photograph. None of this mechanism is relevant to using the lens on digital cameras, which is lucky because the cocking levers are rather clunky to use. For the record, Pentax also produced an identical Zebra 55 f1.9 lens for Tau 29 cameras that were made by Pentax but sold by Sears Roebuck in the United States. Alongside the zebra lenses, Pentax also sold f2 and f2.2 versions of the Auto-Takumar 55s, without the zebra design, but with the same optical design and cocking lever, and the same 10 aperture blades. I'll cover the f2 and the f2.2 together, as they are very, very similar. Indeed, it's often impossible to tell the difference between their images. I have 3 copies, one f2 and 2 f2.2s, one with a silvered aperture ring at the front, and the other with a black aperture ring. All these Auto-Takumars were sold with cameras like this Pentax K from 1958. Most experts on these lenses point out that selling the separate f2 and f2.2 versions was basically a marketing exercise, with the slower version being cheaper to buy. But in reality, the lenses were identical, except for a ring inside the lens that they inserted in front of the blades to limit the maximum aperture, and they added new aperture numbering, of course. Pentax did the same thing with other lenses later on, as we'll see. In terms of the ergonomics of these Auto-Takumars, the focus mechanism is smooth, but the aperture ring isn't as good to use. It's quite stiff to turn, something Pentax sorted out with the next model. At the start of the 1960s, Pentax designed this new Auto-Takumar 55 f1.8. Same name and same optical arrangements, but a new physical design. The aperture ring was moved from the front to the back, and there were fewer aperture blades, 6 rather than 10. One quirk of this particular lens is that the aperture ring turns in a different direction to most of the other Takumar 55s. With the new Auto-Takumar, the cocking lever was replaced with a manual auto switch on the lens that offered a fully automatic diaphragm for the camera. This switch is useful today too on digital cameras if you want to switch between wide open and stop down without using the aperture ring. If you put the switch to manual, then you can stop the lens down to whatever value you want. If it's in auto, then the lens remains wide open regardless of the aperture value on the ring. So you can focus wide open on auto and then move the switch to manual and take the shot stop down. This may not seem to be much of a benefit over rotating the aperture ring, but believe me, it really can save you time. This new design was the basis for all the other Takumar 55s introduced from the early 1960s, starting with the Super-Takumar 55 f1.8 and f2. Again, the slower f2 version was the same as the f1.8 lens, except for a ring inserted inside the lens to reduce the aperture size wide open, and it was sold at a cheaper price. So concentrating on the Super-Takumar f1.8 here, this in fact is just one of 3 different models sold as a Super-Takumar and made between 1962 and 1971. The different models have some cosmetic changes to the physical design, most notably the design of the sculpted metal focus ring notches, as well as some optical and coating tweaks. While we're talking about the focus ring, I should say at this point that Pentax had perfected the manufacture and operation of these rings. They really are some of the smoothest operators of all lenses. You only have to hold this lens to feel how good it is. It's a total joy to use. My version of the lens is an early model. You can tell this by the serial number, the graphic design of the lettering on the front plate, and the style of the focus ring notches. Later versions of the Super-Takumar had multi-coatings rather than the lesser coatings that this lens has. And the later versions of the Super-Takumar, like the Super Multi-Coated model, also had radioactive glass, a subject I'll talk about later. And this brings us on to the Super Multi-Coated Takumar 55 f1.8, launched in 1971, 9 years after the Super-Takumar first appeared. It has the same design as the Super-Takumar, but with those multi-coatings. These coatings were an important innovation, as I'll explain later. As I mentioned in the introduction, the lenses were typically sold as standard fast 50s with the Pentax Spotmatic SP2 camera, and it was a very successful combination for customers and for Pentax commercially. And then in 1972, Pentax replaced the metal focus ring of the 55 lens with this rubber cover, a downgrade in my opinion, and renamed the lens an SMC Takumar. There was also a slower f2 version of this SMC model, unlike the Super Multi-Coated variant that only came as an f1.8. The final lens in this store is the SMC Pentax 55 f1.8. In 1974, Pentax decided to replace the M42 screw mount with a bayonet mount called the K-mount, and at the same time they dropped the Takumar brand name. Some of the old Takumar lens designs were transitioned to the K-mount, others were redesigned. There wasn't much that needed to be improved with the 55 f1.8, so if you happen to use K-mount cameras or K-mount adapters, this is a fine lens worth considering. The only thing missing now is the manual auto switch. That's gone. Now let's turn to how the Takumar 55mm lenses perform optically on digital cameras. As we've already seen, Pentax lens designers experimented with a variety of optical schemes before settling on a classic Ultron design for the lenses, with 6 elements in 5 groups. For most of the discussion, I'll be concentrating on the Ultron design lenses, beginning with the preset Takumar 55 f1.8. However, before that, a few words about the earliest lenses and how they perform. I'll include the Sonotype 58f2 because it's quite an unusual use of a Sona design for this length. My experience with the lens is that the Sona Bokeh is smooth, but not quite as smooth as the later Ultrons. And by that I mean the highlights and shapes in the background tend to look a bit busier. The blur is less smoothed out. So I'd say this particular lens's performance is not as impressive as the Ultron design lenses. I'm not going to cover the Helia Type 58 f2.4, so next up is the preset 55 f2.2. It has 5 elements in 5 groups. This is a different design from the Ultron types that followed. And when I got it, I was curious to see whether its performance is markedly different. I'm going to include the lens in some sharpness and bokeh tests later, but for now I'd say it produces very pleasant bokeh, perhaps a little less smooth compared to the Auto-Takumars, but I like it. And using a detailed extractor in post-processing, you can see the kinds of details this lens can pick up wide open. And then there's the very first and very rare f1.8, the preset model, with 6 elements in 5 groups. Because I don't own this lens, I can't comment directly on how it performs, except to say that I'd be very surprised if it was significantly different from the next model released a year later, the more common Auto-Takumar f1.8, that has the same optical design. I think that these very early lenses are mostly of interest if you're a collector. They can be quite hard to find and expensive to buy, and their performance is really not so very different from the later lenses. But if you are a collector, of course, they do have their own appeal. This brings us on to the other lenses that all have 6 elements in 5 groups, focusing on the M42 mount versions, although I'll include the K-mount version in some of the tests. The main questions I'll be addressing are, how do these lenses differ in terms of their optics and designs, and what impact does this have on their performance? I'm going to cover 4 main features of the lenses, before looking at differences in sharpness, contrast, color rendering and bokeh. The earlier lenses had 10 blades, but from the new Auto and then Super-Takumar design, this was reduced to 6 blades. To compare the impact of 10 versus 6 blades, here's a series of shots taken with the Auto-Takumar f1.8 Zebra and the SMC f1.8 at each of the main stops. The 10-bladed Takumars stopped down to f22, while the 6-bladed ones stopped down to f16. Generally, I prefer having more blades, and it's something to consider when deciding which version of the lens to buy. Something else noticeable from these shots, when the lens is stopped down 1 or 2 stops, are the notches to the aperture blades with the 6-bladed models. I've never really noticed these notches before doing the tests, but all the 6-bladed models have them, and I don't think they're very attractive. So it might be better to avoid stopping down a little when you're trying to capture bokeh highlights. Without these kind of highlights, stopping down is not an issue, and the notches disappear by f4. Secondly, the number of coatings changed from basic single coatings to multi-layered coatings. As a rule of thumb, lenses up to and including all but the latest Super-Takumars are single-coated, or as one contemporary marketing piece put it, they use the latest optical gloss advances. However, the last set of Super-Takumars, built around 1971, do have multi-coatings. The coatings help to reduce light flares, which in turn helps to improve the contrast of the images, not just the overall light and dark contrasts, but they also help to add a vibrancy to the colour contrasts. The coatings don't cut out flares altogether, of course. If you point the lens at the sun, you'll see flaring. And across all the lenses, chromatic aberrations are reasonably well controlled. These lenses are far less likely to exhibit purple fringing than some other fast 50s. Here's a test of the flare resistance of the SMC Takumar. I'm taking this shot very nearly into a low winter sun. As you can see wide open, there's little sign of flares or purple fringing, and that's quite an achievement for an old lens. It makes me smile when some people blanket all old fast 50s as purple fringing or flaring monsters, such as the Mamiya Sequel. The Takuma 55s are by no means the only old lenses to handle bright light so well, but they are some of the better performers. Stop right down. The lens struggles a bit with the light, with this patch of purple and an obvious loss of contrast. But some other old lenses would be showing a lot more flaring in these conditions. This is very much a matter of personal taste, but I rather like the rendering of the single-coated lenses. Yes, they may need an extra contrast boost, but the rendering and colours can be pleasantly dreamy. Of course, I'm talking now about the performance of the lenses wide open, when you're trying to extract the most beautiful and painterly out-of-focus blur, and I'll return to the subject of bokeh later. On the other hand, if you're more interested in the performance top-down, for example you mainly want to use the lens to take family portraits, or as a walk-around-town lens, or as a landscape lens, then the multi-coated lenses are undeniably better at capturing more contrasty images with clear and vibrant colours. Indeed, the later lenses are worthy competitors to modern digital lenses in terms of rendering top-down. As long as the conditions are right, the later lenses really do deliver strong images, with plenty of details for all kinds of post-processing. Thirdly, the subject of radioactive glass, and specifically Pentax's introduction of thorium into the glass elements. It was baked in rather than a coating. I've tested all my lenses with a Geiger Muller counter, and just one of my lenses is radioactive. It's the super multi-coated Takuma 55 f1.8. My early version of the Super-Takumar 55 1.8 is not radioactive. However, according to owners online, the later versions of the Super-Takumar are in fact radioactive. You'll need to do your own research or possibly testing to work out whether the Super-Takumar you're looking at is radioactive or not, and if it is, whether you're happy to use it. You can see what happens if I put the counter up against the back of the super multi-coated version. If this looks bad, then it's not nearly as strong as the readings from the SMC Takuma 50 f1.4, which can be almost 4 times higher, if that's any comfort. One finding from the radioactive tests that surprised me involved the Auto-Takumar 55 f1.8. As to my eyes, the glass is discoloured in a way that suggests that the glass indeed is radioactive. However, the counter is not picking up any readings over and above normal room levels. The reason why Pentax used thorium is that they found it helped the way the light is transmitted through glass, and improved the quality of an image's contrasts and colours. I do believe that the glass does indeed add something positive to the quality of images, and especially the colours this lens produces. Radioactive glass itself tends to discolour over the years, but the golden brown tint can be cured with UV light, as I've done with my copy of the lens. Just to conclude this section on coatings and thorium glass, I'd say that if you want the best possible contrast and colours from a Takuma 55, especially stopped down, then it's probably best to go for the latest SMC versions. But if you're okay with using a radioactive lens, then the super multi-coated version does seem to have something special about it. Fourthly, minimum focusing distance. The older lenses have an MFD of 0.55 meters, while the newer versions are 0.45 meters. 0.45 meters is an okay MFD for a film era fast 50, although not as good as some. The difference between the newer and older lenses doesn't sound that significant on paper. However, if you compare images, the newer lenses really do get in closer, and this opens up more attractive close-up opportunities. And by getting in closer, you can also get bigger bokeh balls if that's what you're interested in. The next set of characteristics to look at with all these lenses involves their sharpness, and then how they render out-of-focus areas and bokeh. Before starting this video, my informal view of sharpness across these lenses was that wide open they're broadly similar at the centre. Stopped down, the later lenses might be sharper towards the edges of the frame, possibly helped too by the better contrast from the multi-coatings. So I did some tests of my lenses to see if the facts supported this view. I began with a close-up composition at each lens's minimum focusing distance, shot wide open on a full-frame camera. I've not sharpened any of these images. I don't think you'll find any of these images look particularly soft wide open. In fact, the reverse. They are all nice and sharp at the centre, focusing on the lettering on the lens. On closer examination, I think the winner here is the SMC Takuma. is producing very clean, sharp lettering, with absolutely no signs of the ghosting that some old lenses can show around the in-focus parts when the lens is wide open. And here's the same composition, with all the lenses stopped right down. It's hard to tell from this quick run-through, but if you examine the images closely, then the later lenses with multi-coatings do have slightly better, more crisp rendering. These compositions don't tell us anything about edge-to-edge sharpness at infinity, so I went outside and took some photographs of a railway station. For this test, I used the earliest 55 f1.8 I own, the Zebra version, from 1958, the Super-Takumar 55 f1.8 from around 1962, and the last SMC version, the SMC from 1973, and I stopped down each lens to f11. I'll zoom into the sign on the left so we can see the details produced by each lens away from the center. I think the results are pretty good for lenses that are over half a century old, and I was pleasantly surprised at how well the early Zebra version performed against the later versions. Even with the reduced contrasts of the lesser coated lenses, these are all lenses you can happily use as walk-around town or landscape lenses stopped down, and expect sharp results. Here are a few examples taken with different lenses, including black and white images, as well as colour images. In fact, some of my own personal favourite images with these Takumar 55s are black and white, where the raw material from the lens lends itself so well to black and white processing. And I should say at this point that 55mm is a fine length for portraits on both full frame and crop sensors, and these lenses have a good combination of sharpness and attractive rendering for portraits. While I don't post a lot of portraits or photos of my family in these videos, the lenses have produced some wonderful family portraits over the years. Last but not least, the bokeh produced by these lenses. I'll kick off by saying that the bokeh from all these lenses is rather beautiful, especially the way they render out-of-focus highlights and bokeh balls. At f1.8, the lenses are easily fast enough to give you strong subject isolation. And even with the f2 and f2.2 lenses, you get a very satisfying depth of field and isolation. The bokeh balls and out-of-focus highlights are some of the best I've seen from any film-era lens. They really are very clean and pleasing to the eye. They're so well rendered, as you can see from this snap of a wall of lights with the Super-Takumar 55 f1.8. The size of these bokeh shapes varies by lens, because the closer focusing lenses produce larger shapes, as I can show you with these next shots, all taken wide open on a full-frame camera, at each lens's minimum focusing distance, again with the Takumar 58 f2 at the beginning and the SMC Pentax 55 f1.8 at the end. The bokeh balls of the early lenses with the longer focusing distance are smaller. And the bokeh balls of the slow lenses are also smaller, i.e. between f1.8, the f2 and the f2.2 lenses. When you get to the newer lenses with a closer minimum focusing distance, starting with the Auto-Takumar version 2, then the bokeh balls are larger. After that, they're all very similar and all, to my eyes, look excellent. What these stage images don't show are the more subtle differences in each lens's bokeh, and this is a more subjective thing, and a matter of taste. Personally, as I've already mentioned, I find the lesser coated lenses tend to render bokeh in a more dreamy way compared to the multi-coated lenses. This gives images, at least in my opinion, a more painterly look, but at the same time, despite their dreamy out-of-focus blur, their center in-focus sharpness is similar to the later multi-coated lenses, so you still have the advantages of center sharpness to anchor the more dreamy blur. If I want to get the most beautiful bokeh-rich images from these lenses, then I'll take out one of the early Auto-Takumar lenses, the ones with the cocking levers. I think a big reason for this painterly look is the lack of multi-coatings. Compared to multi-coated lenses, this means that there are more light leaks across the images, and this contributes to a more dreamy, almost watercolory look to the contrasts and colours. That's for painterly bokeh. For other kinds of effects, The later lenses have the advantages of that closer focusing distance, which makes their background blur just a little bit smoother. It helps to produce those larger bokeh balls, and you're going to get more vibrant, less washed out colours. In the end, all the Takumar 55s are capable of producing stunning wide-open images that in the right light are arguably better than many fast 50mm lenses. It's surprising what a difference that 5mm can make to an image's depth of field and its out-of-focus blur, and some people argue that these 55s are better than the more expensive Takumar 50s when it comes to wide-open shots. The super multi-coated Takumar 55 f1.8 was the first interchangeable prime lens I used. Since then I've become both a user and collector of this lens series, and I've never been disappointed with any of the lenses. Each one has something to offer, something that you can't get from modern digital primes or zooms. It's the feel and look that's different, whether it's the dreaminess of the lesser coated lenses wide open, or the beautiful rendering of the multi-coated lenses stopped down, a rendering that I find more appealing than high-definition images taken by modern digital lenses. So in conclusion, if you're wondering which lens to buy across the series, then it really depends on your preferred style of photography. If you're interested in wide-open bokeh compositions, then you could consider the earlier lenses, and you don't have to have the fastest f1.8 version. The f2 and f2.2 versions will do a great job as well. The aperture ring's a bit clunky, but you may choose to leave the lens wide open for most of the time anyway. If you're into a mix of wide open and stopped down compositions, then the later lenses may be better, as they're more contrasty, and they have a closer minimum focusing distance, and the focus and aperture mechanisms are so smooth, they're a pleasure to use. And if you use a K-mount or K-mount adapter, the SMC Pentax version is a worthy alternative to the M42 mount lenses. Having said all this, it's hard to make generalizations, as the later lenses can produce beautiful bokeh as well, and the earlier lenses are no slouches stopped down, plus they have more aperture blades to play with. If you ask me that difficult question, if you could only keep one lens, which would it be? Well, for purely sentimental reasons, it would have to be the super multi-coated radioactive lens. And actually, in terms of performance, rightly or wrongly, I do believe the thorium glass adds a touch of magic to some images. But then I'm also very fond of the Auto-Takumar Zebra f1.8, a rarer lens that produces very painterly bokeh. Oh, and the last SMC is such a strong all-round lens. And the more common Super-Takumar is great value for money. So I suppose the honest answer is to say I'd simply go out and buy all the lenses again. And a postscript to where I started, talking about walking into a photography shop in the early 1970s and being recommended Pentax gear. I know this is true because I was there, as a young boy. We were on holiday and went into a camera shop to buy a new camera. The shop did indeed recommend the Pentax Spotmatic and Takumar 55 f1.8 and a couple of other lenses. The gear wasn't for me, but I inherited it shortly afterwards, and it's been my good fortune to use it for many, many years on both film cameras and digital cameras. It may be radioactive, but over 50 years later I'm still around, with most of my faculties intact. I'm looking forward to reading your experiences and comments on these lenses and this video. If you've enjoyed the video and haven't already subscribed, please do. And until next time, thanks for watching.